thought you
No, I couldn't.
Right.
But I do get it.
Well, you have to look at
Correct.
All right, I think we're ready to get started. We have a mic available, but can everybody hear me? Okay, good evening everyone and welcome to Better Read Than Dead, and good evening to those people that are here with us on Zoom. Hello, my name is Reen, and on behalf of everyone here at Better Read Than Dead, thank you so much for coming as we are here to celebrate the release of not just one but two debut novels by Natasha Sholl and Jessie Stevens. So thank you very much for being here. To begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of the country we are meeting on today. We recognise their continued connection to the land and waters and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all First Nations people with us today. Okay, so a bit of housekeeping before we go. If you haven't found them already, the toilets are just through that door to your right. In case of an emergency, please make your way downstairs. The shop is closed, so you'll be able to get out very quickly. We have drinks and snacks if you haven't already found them, so please help yourself. And can I just ask that you put your phones on silent if you haven't already. The event. The event will go, we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end of the evening. And if you're with us on Zoom, please just use the chat function to join us with any questions. If you have pre-ordered a copy of the books, they should be waiting for you over there. And if you haven't pre-ordered them, and if you don't have your hands already on these two incredible books, they are available for purchasing. Because the store is shut, you can purchase them from me. So just come and find me at the end of the event and I'll do that for you. And I know that both Natasha and Jessie will be tonight. So get your hands on one. I know I will be doing that tonight. All right. The reason why we're gathered here today, like I said, to celebrate these two debut novels by Natasha and Jessie. Natasha Sholl is a Melbourne-based writer and life lawyer. Her writing has appeared in The Age, Sydney Morning Herald, Good Weekend Magazine, SBS Voices, Mamamia, and elsewhere. She graduated from the University of Melbourne, majoring in creative writing. In 2020, she completed the KYD Mentors Program. Found Wanting is her debut book. Jessie. Jessie Stevens is the author of an internationally best-selling book, Heartsick. She is an executive editor at Mamamia and co-hosts Mamamia Out Loud and Cancelled. She is a regular on ABC radio and television, and her work has appeared in Body and Soul, Vogue, and Liquor. That's my opinion. Over to you two.
Thank you so much.
You're very
All right, let's get started. So, Jessie, just to set the tone, can I ask you to do just a short reading from your book? Yes, for anyone who hasn't read the book, I'm going to do just a few paragraphs which really capture at the end sort of a love affair, I suppose a love affair gone wrong, but you'll know more once you read it. Sometimes she wonders if she would have been enough for Rob, a man who always wanted more, who moved to Sri Lanka because Australia wasn't enough, and who spends most of his time with people richer than he is, who are more powerful than him, as though he's trying to leave something behind. Paul isn't perfect. He's a man who has been happy with moderate success, who has done practically everything that was expected of him, but nothing more. But he is home, and she will always be enough for him. She stares at him across the dinner table. A white fleck of potato is hanging from his bottom lip, and she realises you can love two people at once, in two different ways. They don't tell you that in novels. They don't warn you that sometimes a story ends partway through chapter 15, with loose ends and plot holes and characters unredeemed. Sometimes you end up with the wrong man, and you work to make him the right one. And while you do, your heart does not slowly mend itself, but breaks a little more in every moment of every day. And 2 years after that first kiss, she loves Rob as much as she always did.
So jumping straight in, so reading Heartsick, I only felt complete empathy for the characters. I only use the term characters broadly because they are based on real people, but in many times I felt like I was spending time with friends or people I knew, or even parts of myself, which is a weird way to describe it, but that is how it felt. So as a writer, how do you get that balance? So telling the details of someone's life while at the same time ensuring that nothing felt exploitative or voyeuristic.
It's really hard, and I know that you would have experienced it to a much greater degree than me, I think. I was really careful about the protection of the subjects in this. So, for example, I ensured that everything that I read, they got final sign off, and they knew that from the beginning. So I think that made them feel safe, that nothing was going to be published that they said and then wanted retracted. I also made sure there was one subject in particular, and her name in the book is Anna, and I made sure with her that any identifying details were really hidden, because there would be such ramifications in her real life if people knew who she was. It would, like, literally everything that she had built would fall apart if her husband or if anyone knew that it was her. And so it was funny, about halfway through even doing the research, I had to, in my own head, start calling her Anna. Like, I have to think now, oh, what's her real name? I had to actually train myself, because I thought, you'll be talking about this book and it will just fall out, because she's someone that you know and almost feels like a friend now. But that was critical to the book. My worst nightmare would be if someone felt exploited or like I had misrepresented them. So I sent it off to them at the end and said, what do you think? Terrified, because it was a week away from death. It's just but they all said, this is great. I like you captured it. I don't think there were any, the only thing they had was more things they wanted added. So, like, I think it was really important, this letter that this person sent, which I thought was good. And I remember Patrick said, I feel bad for Patty, like, which was of course him. But he felt compassion for himself and looked at it from a different point of view. So the fact it wasn't their names, the fact that some details had been changed and lives had been turned into scenes, I don't think that people realise how much that can change a story sometimes. And I would be interested in your perspective on that, because this didn't happen yesterday. A lot of it was time that has elapsed. How do you choose a scene to start with and to capture a feeling?
For me, and I guess memoir is slightly different because I'm writing about my own life, but it was just whatever came to me at that time. So I didn't sit down and say, right now I'm going to write a book from beginning to end. The book itself started in the notes section of my phone. So I'd be going for a walk and something would just come to me. And I'm like, that's a weird memory to suddenly pop up right now. So it would go from the notes section of my phone to my laptop, and there was no chronological order. It was this mishmash of memories, and sometimes it was that fallibility of memory that was the interesting part. So something would come to me and I think back, did that happen quite like that? And why am I remembering it with, why is that scene so important? Why is that context, like the flavor of something and the temperature, and yet other things, like really major important things like the day of a funeral, for example, I had no memory of the weather, or, so things came to me and I just had to accept however they came to me, that's how they were going to come out, and I couldn't control that narrative. Whereas I guess for you, anonymizing people, you could control what came out and how it came out.
And I made it clear with them and also with the reader straight up that if there was no recollection of whether that day was hot or cold, I would be decided. And that's because I think as a storyteller, like as someone who's wanting to write a compelling story, sometimes the detail of a tablecloth, it's truth, but it's not fact. So it's like the fact that it was raining, the truth that it was raining that day kind of massaged the story in a direction I wanted it to go. I didn't invent anything, but there were definitely, I said, I'm going to be taking licenses with this. Are you comfortable? And luckily they were.
So my next question to you is, Heartsick is a book about breakups, and while it is a book about three individuals and their relationships, it feels like the themes are completely universal and relatable, regardless of someone's relationship history. So why do you think that is? It's not just a breakup book. There's so much more to it.
Yeah, I think the books that I love to read the most And I now have almost a checklist where every time I read, I go, okay, what did I love about that? And how am I going to do that? And I have a checklist now, and it's just the weirdest things. Like I find a lot of crime fiction will focus on things like appetite and whether or not the person's tired, and there's something that draws me in. And so one thing I love about reading, the thing I probably love the most, is universal observation. So there will be lines in books that I go, oh my goodness, I never knew other people thought like that. And it will be some truth that just captures something unsayable. And you think, how did that come to that person's mind? And so when I knew intentionally that that's what I wanted to do, and that that's what I thought the best writing looks like, I made sure to layer that. And so hopefully that comes through, and there are particular observations. I think there were definitely passages where I went too far with that, and an editor had to pull back and go, the narrator couldn't have known that, so you need to be really careful. But the universality of heartbreak was something that was the whole point. And it's weird how the specific is the universal. So you could write a whole book of cliche about heartbreak, but it wouldn't speak to anyone, because they're like, oh, I don't know what you mean when you say your heart felt broken. I don't know what that means. But then you talk about, I wanted to vomit, or so-and-so vomited in a rose bush, or so-and-so couldn't put her phone down, or she could feel sweat rolling down under her armpits because she was so anxious. And you go, that's the universal, because it gets to something that we don't talk about. Yeah, that's cool. I would love if you could read an excerpt from Found Wanting that I was just thinking about today. I would love to hear it.
So this is also near the end as well. When Matt died, I raised no money to fund research for the heart condition he died from, the one I forgot the name of over and over. I was both an amazing and shit and average wife and mother. I sometimes lost my temper. I still got road rage. I crossed no finish lines. I got no PBs. I helped no small children looking for friends to play with. In the days and weeks after Matt's death, I was stopped on the street constantly. People told me how amazing my sister-in-law was. They had read a recent post on her Facebook page, always looking up, always looking at the positives, the moments of sunshine through the clouds. She was inspiring, they told me, and they were inspired. How amazing is your brother? People stopped and told me in the months after Matt's death. Andrew's physical transformation was obvious. They saw him training, running laps around the park. They saw his progress photos. They saw his results from his latest marathon. They were inspired because he was an inspiration. I imagined my brother and my sister-in-law being stopped in the street. She's just so average, with her crippling panic attacks and the sour look she always has on her face. I was not inspiring, they would whisper. They were not inspired. I didn't want to look up. I didn't want to run 42.2 kilometres and beat my PB. People died and I just wanted to be sad about it, sometimes, often. I was too tired, too beaten, too weary to be a better person. I didn't want to break records or start movements or inspire. If I could be a better version of myself, I'd want to be the kind of person who didn't bite my nails, the kind of person who didn't pick at my cuticles until they bled, who could just leave well enough alone. We could go to a party or watch TV or be stuck in traffic without constantly picking at rough edges and hangnails. That was the sum of my big life goals, and even that was not something I actively strove to achieve.
I love that so much. And I was thinking, I have thought a lot about meaning and post-traumatic growth, especially, I think, maybe with the pandemic and just over the last few years, it's like everyone's looking for the silver lining, and every time we tell a story, it's got to have some didactic truth to it that, you know, makes us better. And you write in the book about stages of grief and how there's this new one, which is meaning. Do you think that grief always has meaning? Does that sit comfortably with you, that idea?
It doesn't sit comfortably with me, but not in like a pessimistic, negative way. I think, and it's probably because those stages of grief have been misunderstood and people view it as a sort of linear path where something bad happens and then you come out the other side this better person. And I never felt like a better person. I just felt really tired most of the time. So I think for me, that sort of resilience aspect isn't so much coming out being someone who can run a marathon or do all these other amazing things. For me, the resilience is being able to sit in that feeling of grief and know I could survive it, because for so long I did things that were sort of self-sabotaging, or I sabotaged relationships. So I think that resilience aspect and that sort of meaning is to say you can feel grief and you can feel joy, and those two feelings can coexist at the exact same time, which is something I sort of didn't realise before. And just you can have this magical, wonderful life at the exact same moment as you're still heartbroken about something that happened yesterday, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And that to me is the meaning, like the duality of those existence.
Do you think that there's pressure though to say, my brother died and since he died, I have learned X, Y, and Z? Do you think that there is almost, like, whether it's social or it's cultural, there's some pressure to have some profound wisdom that's been kind of, that you found within tragedy?
Yeah, I think there's definitely that sort of cultural expectation, and even some of like the articles that I've been asked to write more recently, I'll write something and it's to do with that, not wanting to have to come out the other side of it of personal learn lessons, and whoever's written the title of it will be like, here are the lessons I learned from grief. I'm like, that's opposite of what I'm saying. So I think the lesson is that there are no lessons, which sounds really bleak, but it's grief is this fact of life that is really difficult to accept, because we have to struggle with our own mortality. I mean, how do you wake up every day knowing like that the people you love, something really awful could happen? So yeah, I think the meaning and those lessons are just that acceptance of I will risk loving people because it's worth it in the end, and I will continue to love those people.
I wanted to ask you about writing about trauma. The two worst things that ever happened to you are really what this book is about.
Yeah.
How does it feel having people rummage around in your pocket, whether that's asking you to write an article, interviews, I mean, people messaging you, I'm sure, which can be, a compliment because it means your work has resonated, but it can also, I imagine, be quite startling to have that brought up all the time. How do you have, especially after writing this, those two things not bleed into your day-to-day life every single second?
Well, the reality is I made a decision to write this book, and so I've been living in these draft versions since 2019. So I've been very much living that, whereas other people didn't necessarily agree for me to write that book. So I was very conscious of, I made this decision, therefore whatever the fallout is, whatever the response is, that's actually not my business anymore. People can take it and interpret it however they want, and the response to it is the response to it because I made a decision. Other people in my life didn't necessarily make the decision. Even the people who were completely supportive and who were, were so proud of me, at the end of the day, if they're getting questions about this, that's a response to something I made a decision about. So I think those boundaries were something I was quite conscious of. And the week before it was published, I completely spiraled. I was like, I've made a mistake, take it back. Nobody read it. Don't tell publicity. But then the reality is I did make this decision, and people have been so overwhelmingly supportive in the comments, and they've been so generous with their feedback. And the people who have written messages to say, my partner died when I was 22, like the similarities are just eerie. And I think, well, it makes it worth it, because they say, I see myself in this, and you've explained something to myself that I couldn't understand before, and you've put words to a feeling. And everyone has been quite respectful of those boundaries. No one's writing to me saying, fix me, or what do you, like, help me. It's the opposite. They're giving me something, which is to say, I feel validated, and that's a gift to me. They're not taking something from me. So there has always been that respect of boundaries, and I've been really lucky in that regard.
Yeah, I went on to Goodreads because I'm always interested in what people great rating, may I say. Great rating. You don't want to read too many because they're horrific on everyone. So it's like and this wasn't on yours, but every memoir I read, someone says this is very self-absorbed. Imagine a memoir that is. I also wanted to ask about the use of humour in your book, and I read something recently that said, on the worst day of your life, something funny happens, and on the best day of your life, something bad. Like it's, and yet there is this desire when you're writing to have a scene, and I'm finding this at the moment, sad scene, good scene, and to have a day where everything goes wrong and not have the nuance of the good and the bad. How did you, was it uncomfortable at times writing and going, there was this, I'm getting this really funny memory, but it feels like this was on the day that someone died. Like how do you incorporate that?
I think when I started writing from the outset, like I'd avoided writing it for so long because it just felt, the whole thing just felt a bit uncomfortable. But when I committed to writing it, it was like, I'm just going to write the truth of this experience. And therefore, whatever the truth of that experience is there on the page. And the truth is, grief is absurd. Like it's a ridiculous concept that someone you love and who is in your life and who you like your lives revolve around each other is just suddenly not there. Like that's absurd.
And it's so serious.
Yeah.
It's like, and that's the thing, like things happen every day that aren't, but it's the most serious thing that then it's almost, what you did so well was almost contrast that with the absolute not seriousness of what else. It's like, yeah, but what are we, it's 11. Yeah, like it's the weirdest.
I read an article just recently, someone forwarded it to me, and it was to do with grief brain. And so it was like the neuroscience behind it. I'm not going to explain it because I'm words, I'm not science. And it was to do with that when you fall in love with someone or where you love someone, family, friends, your brain is sort of hardwired to then want to protect those people and love those people. So there's that bond, like an evolutionary thing. But when someone dies, that bond thing is still there because you still love them. So that bond's not broken. So it takes a while for your brain to then realise that they're no longer there. So that leads to this whole absurdity of grief. And
which is what you describe about still picking up your phone.
And that's what so many people still like relate to. And it is, so it's not like ha-ha humour, but it's that weirdness of the everyday and those little moments, because that grief brain hasn't sort of integrated the fact that that person is no longer physically there. So I'm still, even now, having moments where it's like I'll bump into my brother at the bakery, but it's not my brother because my brain still has that bond and that connection to that person. And so naturally, if you're writing the truth of what happened, there are going to be those moments of humour and that balance of light and dark, because life is really weird.
Yeah. No, exactly right. Very interesting.
I wanted to throw to you. So there is so much love about Heartsick, but one of the things that struck me was that it is non-fiction that reads like fiction. So it's very pacey, which is weird for a book that tells you from the outset exactly how things will end. So was the tone of the book and that very particular voice you have interwoven throughout the pages something that came naturally to you, or is that just how you started writing it, or was it something you had to build on?
I was very much, as I was writing, and I'm sure this being your first book as well, you would have had the same thing, like people talk about imposter syndrome and all that you go, no, this isn't a syndrome, this is me realistically looking at the fact I'm an absolute imposter and I don't know what I'm doing. And so I become obsessed with learning rules, and it can become quite toxic because it's really a tool of procrastination to just be like, how to write a book, what are the rules of writing a book? Like, and I read, On Writing by Stephen King and like Bird by Bird and just all these books, and it was my procrastination was learning how to write. But what I got to was, and Jane Harper writes a lot about her like creativity and how to write. But I also, everything that I read, a lot of people when they're writing don't read. I do the opposite. I read more because I am reading it differently, which is I am stealing everything that this person does well.
And stealing.
Yes, that's been going on. Exactly. Yes, exactly. I go, okay, why was that chapter so good? And then kind of, break it down. And so one thing I loved about Jane Harper in particular was that she used to be a journalist, and she would write really clicky headlines, which I was like, same. I've been given stories that are pretty dry and I've got to make people click on them. I probably write Natasha has some lessons about grief, which is not true, but people think. And so I went through and realised that what Jane Harper did that was so good was these cliffhangers, but it was almost like clickbait at the end of every chapter. I can write clickbait. I can do that. And so what I did was I went, what would make someone at the end of this chapter? There was this rule that I read that said every page and every chapter there's got to be a question, and you don't keep turning the pages if that question is answered. So you've just got to keep opening new questions. And so I just made sure that question was loud on that page, so that then when you were going to the next person, it was in the back of your head. And that was a very intentional decision as well, to split them up into chop between, which is Leanne Moriarty, I think, does that. Mary Keyes often does that. Everyone I love, I just stole it. Because I knew that that's what kept it pacey, that I have to be wanting to know what's happening with Anna at the same time that I'm reading Patrick. Because I think that in an attention economy where you can put that down and jump on TikTok or jump on Netflix at any point, then you've got to write a book that people can't put down. And that's really hard, but it's also like, it makes me better, which I know a lot of people said about your book as well, that they started it, and because it was, the question in your book was how? Like, how does she get out of bed? And then just when you think you're starting to understand it, boom, like that other question comes, which is that there's another tragedy, and you think, okay, now she really can't. But that's what I think. They're the books that get me.
You do it so well. Like, I'd finish a chapter, I'm like, oh, that was mean. Like, no, I want to go back there. But then you'd suck me into the next chapter, and you do it very well. So one of the many sentences that jumped out at me when I read Heartsick was, the world is full of broken people who have put themselves back together, which I loved. So much of this book is about all the ways people break, both inside of and outside of relationships. And while it speaks to human strength and our capacity for growth and resilience, it also doesn't tie things up in a neat little bow. There's none of that typical narrative arc that we so often see in fictionalized breakup stories. So can you speak to this a bit? I guess it's a bit like what we were talking about before. So the way you balance those elements of hope, like, you don't want it to be a depressing book where people like, oh, but yeah, it's real life. So how did you balance that?
And I found it really hard. And this is probably, I've been criticized for this before, like, I'll pitch something at work as a story and they're like, that is just so depressing. So what can people do to help? Nothing, they should do. And that's not how people want to live. So you write this book, and then I got to the final chapter. I remember I was writing it the weekend before it was due and going, I didn't want to come to a conclusion. Like, that was the whole point, but then you have to. And I thought it with your book as well, how much, that's why I loved the excerpt I got you to read so much, because of I can imagine the editorial pull, the pull within yourself to go, and here's the sentence that puts it all together. And I think in a storytelling culture as well, where every Facebook post and Instagram post and whatever we write has to come to some profound point. I notice it with, people going, it's okay if you have a bad day. And then they write this whole thing and it's like a lesson for me. Yeah. And I'm like, that's weird. Why are we trying to teach each other things all the time? Why can't things just be a mess? And so I did find that difficult to leave them in such pain, even though that was the point. But I think it needed the final chapter, which I felt, I loved Three Women. That was a massive inspiration for me, because I could see structurally how this could be done. But what she didn't do, which I know why she didn't in her case, was tell me why it all mattered. And like, I think a lot of people get to the end of a book and go, what was that about? Yeah. And I wanted to write a chapter that went, this is what it's all about and this is why it matters. And I went through what we need in terms of whether it's ritual or what we're doing so wrong with and I think you did the same when it came to the right type of grief and the right way to grieve. And so there were learnings in that way. And then I did come to the point about broken people putting themselves back together, and that the real pain is actually being with someone that doesn't love you back. And that was a big realization that I had writing it, that more painful than being on your own are actually those last seconds, or pushing something and looking at someone and going, oh, you don't love me back. That's way worse. So heartbreak can be actually a silver lining in that you don't have to look at someone who doesn't love you anymore.
Because just trying to change you all
Yes,
the time.
exactly.
You know, that clear storyline, like,
Yes.
you know, as a reader, you're like, no, stop. But,
Yeah, get
you
out
know,
of that. It's just making you worse.
Yeah.
So I think that was quite a realization towards the end.
But there is also something, when you're showing that mess and muck of the reality of life, there is something so validating for other people, and that does sort of tie it in a way. Like when you're showing like this is the reality and people can be a little bit broken, and people reading it feel validated and seen.
Yes.
And so
And
you
that's-
open that up to people.
Yeah, and interestingly, I think that you and I probably had very similar intentions when we started, which was how do I put words around an inexpressible feeling? Which, I mean, grief and heartbreak, you can't say they've never been written about before. They absolutely have. But why is it that you and I both felt that there was more to be said in a different way?
Mhm.
And I think that was the hardest thing of the whole project, like plot and structure and all of that I could get around. It was just sitting down and going, the reason why there are so many shit metaphors is because this is impossible to explain. And like, there are terrible songs, or you've got to write something and you're like, that already exists. Like everything has been said in a bad way. So you had to find these ways to kind of, and the beauty came through in the interviews where someone would say something and I'd go, oh, that's it. And maybe that was probably easier for me because when we had that connection, I went, yeah, right, this is probably a thing that's quite universal.
Yeah.
And I wondered with yours in terms of, again, like the what happened is one thing that an author has to write and grapple with. How do you sit down and write about something that is felt, not thought? Because the chronology of something is something you can write about, but grief is a feeling that most people have no words for. Where do you begin?
And I think that was the thing that put me off writing it, because I thought I can't start writing it until I've made sense of it. And how do you make sense of it? And again, it's that trying to rationalize things and make sense of it. And so that's what I just, every time I sat down, I was like, no, I still don't know the answer yet. Like I had to understand it. And I was like, what if I write into the fact that it makes no sense and just write the feelings of it and just write the truth of it and the sucky parts and, you know, the bleak parts and the funny parts and all of it. And so I just started writing the truth of it. And, you know, when you take that thought process out and you take out the trying to make sense and grapple with those alternate realities and all the lives we could have lived and how to make sense of that, I mean, you can't. And so I had to start writing not knowing really how the book was going to end up, and I had to sort of write into that.
Do you think it helped in terms of getting some understanding? Did you feel like you had processed the grief more fully in writing about it?
Yeah, I would say if you're looking for healing, like don't write a memoir. Go to therapy. In some ways, yes, only because I sort of had that, like I made more sense to myself. Like all these things I've been scared to say, like bubbling underneath the surface and afraid to put into words. Like I was scared to put words into, I was scared to what I would find out about myself. So having it in written form, like it's almost like, oh, I make sense now, and I make sense more to other people probably. And I wrote about the grief less as this is what happened to me and isn't that so sad and tragic. Like it wasn't like that at all. I tried to sort of take myself out of it, and if anyone else could put themselves in that, like their own circumstances, would that grief experience still ring true? And so in that way it was a bit less like sort of opening old wounds and more just writing to the truth of grief. So that's why in some ways it's more like a grief memoir and less a memoir about me and more a memoir about what it means to lose someone.
A feeling. And that's that observation, it was like it was leaking off every page in terms of, oh my God, that's so true. And it's never been said like that before, which is a very difficult, it's the hardest thing to do, I think. And so it was just so well done. I wanted to ask about it. In a way, this is written in opposition to the idea that there is a right way to grieve and that people are doing it wrong. What do you think culturally is the right way to grieve that we expect of people?
So I think we don't know, like we're so confused as a culture, and it's because it makes us feel uncomfortable, which is totally understandable. But it's this sort of contradictory thing where if someone can't get out of bed, for example, we're like, oh, well, they're not coping. Like, well, no, that's sort of response to a really sad situation. Like there were days where I literally could not get off the floor. I was just like lying on the floor, and it was like, oh, well, she's not coping. And then if you're out with friends having dinner, it's like, oh, she's better and she's doing really well. And actually, you could be at the supermarket checkout line and look like you're functioning and, you know, re-entering society and heartbroken and thinking about the person you've lost and still functioning as a human. And to the outside eyes, you probably think like, oh, okay, well, she's doing really well. But you don't really, it's like that long tail of grief that I think our culture is not really comfortable and doesn't really understand, like those long-lasting impacts. So there's this narrative of grief being linear, and you go through the stages of grief and you come out the other side and then you're fixed. But it's like, that's why I loved that line that I read out before about those broken people. Like you're always a little bit broken, like it leaves that imprint in you. And I think there's so much judgment, and often it's just from ourselves. Like what I wrote about in here, I wasn't criticizing anyone else. It was more just to do with the judgment of, we always feel like we're doing it wrong. We're moving on too fast. We're not moving on fast enough. Whatever we're doing, we feel like we're never enough. And so I just wanted to give people permission to say, however you feel on any given day, and it's going to change, even within the 24-hour period, you're going to go, you know, it's always going to change. And you can't just hold on to that feeling. It's like these waves that come at you. And so it was more about giving people permission to say, however you grieve.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the common theme, I think, and this was something I think that was in one of my first chapters about how you can be heartbroken from someone that has left you or that cheated on you and is now with someone else, and it's 20, 30, 40 years on, and you can be deeply in love and there is nothing wrong with your relationship but still grieve that person. And I thought you wrote about that so perfectly, because I think a lot of people feel uncomfortable about that. People who have been lost someone that they love. My grandmother lost her husband when he was about 28 and went on to marry again, and there was always this sense of like, well, he'll never be Kevin. Like, and that was kind of a thing that was around, and I just thought it was like no one could say it or like look at them properly, or she was not judged for moving on.
She was judged.
Yeah. Just, well, how much did you love? Yeah. Or, you know, like it's this really gross, and it's funny because it's coming from people who have no idea what it would be like to lose that person.
Yeah.
But it's obviously common, and then you find someone that you love in a different way. How do you go about explaining to people who have no blueprint how you can love someone fully and as legitimately as your relationship, but also love someone else who's not here anymore?
I think you can't explain it fully, honestly. And I think no one had even asked those questions until I wrote the book. And the only person who really understood it is my husband, Dean, because it's just, you know, it's the two of us together. He was all in from the very beginning, and he was the one that gave me space, who never, like from the outset, was like, well, you love someone and they died, and that connection, like, is that connection, and I just need you to love me fully. I'm not asking you to not love that person. I'm asking, you know, as long as our relationship is rock solid. And so we started from this foundation of just being open about that. And from the outset, he and I had that understanding. And whether other people from the outside, you know, they'll judge whatever people do. But I think hopefully now people have a bit more understanding.
I've heard it said as well, I think it was in an interview, and they said life is for the living. And so what you need to do is is honour that. But what that person would want, as you say as well, is for you to experience joy in all the things that you might have experienced with that person. And there are instances of that, you know, where the person is alive, but I had someone, you know, just tell me this week that it's like the person that they loved 20 years ago, they could run into them on the street and they've got a rock solid marriage. It's not that. But some part of them isn't resolved about this and they never will be. It doesn't mean they're going to run away with them.
Yeah.
But I think that exists in a lot of people and you do not talk about it because it suggests that there is a problem with your current relationship.
Yeah, and I think, and that's what you did so well as well, was that thing of it's not about heartbreak, it's about heartbreak, but it's not just about heartbreak, it's about what happens when those unlived lives kind of bubble underneath the surface. And that was especially true, obviously, of Anna's story, but all of them really, like, especially when you don't have control of that narrative, what happens when life takes a different turn and that, those unlived lives sort of rule away.
Yeah, which is a type of grief and a different type of grief. And it's in some ways, I think writing it, I was going, you know, at least when someone dies, there's a funeral and there's a way to commemorate them, and it can be different with heartbreak because there's no commemoration really, and people they kind of give you 2 weeks. But the way that you wrote about it made me think about grief very differently because it's not that simple, and the way that there are tiers of grief and a sense that if you are a sibling or a parent, then you're a particular level of closeness, and then below that are, say, friends, and then below that are the colleagues, and you almost can't grieve upwards. Which I find it really interesting.
Yeah, and that comparison, like the grief comparison, that's not helpful. Like, you know what I mean? Like, grief is grief is grief. That's it. Wherever you sit on that spectrum, it's a feeling. But it did remind me when you were talking about those heartbreaks and the experience of bumping into people on the street. So I have a question about how you wrote about those other people, so not the people you interviewed, but the people on the other side of that, because they could have just been. And when we do break up with people, the reaction as friends is to villainize them a bit, like, oh, you could do better, and they were so horrible, and I never liked it anyway. So how did you build those like characters again in inverted commas? How did you build those people as sort of three-dimensional, fully formed people without just, you know, thinking that stereotype?
I think the use of the word characters is actually really important because to me they were characters because I never spoke to them. But I knew that in order for the story, and this is said of any villain in any show, like if they don't have a redeeming factor, if they don't have something that draws people to them, then they're a two-dimensional character that you're never, ever going to engage with or believe. So particularly in the case of Anna, she had her partner, Paul, who it was really important, and she did a really good job of this. He was lovely. He seemed like a great husband. There was nothing in that relationship that was necessarily lacking except for the fact that they'd been together for 25 years and you lose that excitement and the butterflies, and then when something comes along, I think it's very, very difficult to resist. And so that was able to convey some nuance in infidelity that I didn't appreciate until I wrote this story. But I don't think that would have worked at all if I'd made Paul out to be this gross, mean guy that doesn't do anything and actually like interrogating infidelity. It's really easy when you see a character and you're like, well, their partner sucks, of course they would do that. But in fact, if you look at a lot of cases of infidelity, the partner's amazing. Like it's not that. And same with the others, like with Claire, I found that was probably the hardest because she felt, I don't want to say emotionally abusive, but it definitely went into that. It veered into that. And she was really mean to her. And there was evidence of that, like, and that's the thing, is there was a lot of primary evidence in terms of text messages and pictures and all that kind of stuff. But Claire, because a little bit of time had passed, she was very aware that she had gone into that relationship with poor mental health, and there were things that she did that made the relationship hard. That's not to blame anyone, and in fact I can really relate with that, with having ebbs and flows and the way that mental health can make relationships disproportionate in terms of one looking after the other. And there were people who read that and went, Claire had so many issues and heartbreak was the least of her issues. Like, which I went, that's interesting, because that was Claire's point of view. Like, she was very aware of that. But I've thought since how interesting it would be to write the book from the other three and to go, how did they see the demise of the relationship? And then I think Patrick actually was really, really good, because I am a woman, and a lot of what he was telling me, I was going, I can see that from the other point of view, and you were so emotionally absent or whatever. And he'd done a lot of work as well in discovering that. I think if any of them had been a week out, then the stories wouldn't have made sense. And it was just that a bit of time had passed and they'd worked it out. And also that they could provide me with material where I could almost come and go, oh, I see what happened here.
So you could see the other point of view.
Yeah, a little bit, I think. Should we open it up to questions? Sure. Did anyone have any questions? And I know there are like writers as well in the room. Any writing questions?
I'll ask a writing question. No one else.
Yeah.
What's your advice? If there are any writers on Zoom, what is a piece of writing advice you can offer?
I think about this. I just copy other people's writing advice and often give it when I'm not doing it. But the biggest has probably been about you cannot write and edit at the same time. And I always talk about that because I'm so bad at it. And so I have to work on it all the time. So today I was writing, and I've got to, sometimes when you get stuck, and a lot of people talk about writer's block and stuff, you've just got to write out an actual, like a sentence that doesn't make sense. And then when it comes out on the page, you're like, nothing happened. Like the world didn't fall in, you can write crap and no catastrophe is going to occur. And so what I'm trying to do at the moment, my new strategy, don't know if it's any good because no one's read it, is just to go, okay, write down what happened. And if this is hard, then you can go, and then Jake went to the beach, and then you can go back when you're in a different frame of mind and a different mood with a completely different hat on and edit those words. And I've heard people say that, which is good writing. Good writing is the art of rewriting, or something like that. And that's what I find difficult, I think, with reading, because when I read this, I only read the final copy, and so I'm like, imagine it comes out. Imagine. Yes, exactly. I want to see the mess that I'm sure is the first thing of all of us not making sense and looking up a synonym for big or whatever. So that's probably the biggest thing, and knowing that you learn things even like how to write dialogue or how to write, how to use metaphor or something. You're also learning to write as you write.
Yeah.
So you don't need to be the perfect writer when you start. That will come to and only through writing, because you can put off writing for literally an entire life, because you're never going to be qualified enough to start, and you're always going to be qualified enough to start. Yeah. How about you? What would be your writing tip after?
Similar to that in terms of just trust the mess of it, which I guess is similar to what you're saying. And that was the reason, again, I spent so long not writing, because I was like, oh, well, a real writer probably feels like a real writer. And they sit down after, like Stephen King in his leather chair in his study. And I was, so sometimes I was in a writer's group. So I joined my local writer's group, and Eleni Hale, who was taking it, said she wrote her book, Stone Girl. She had a full-time job and would write on the train on the way to work in 20-minute blocks. And for some reason, that just changed everything for me. Oh, a real writer can just snatch time wherever, whenever, and you just steal time where you can. So I think for me, it's that thing of, yes, some people have a full day and they can sit down at their desk and write from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. But if not, spend 20 minutes on the train, write what you can, might be in the notes section of your telephone, that's fine. And yeah, so just trust the mess of it, and the
And
more you
that's-
write
yeah.
it suddenly appears.
That's what Sally Hepworth says is her 350. She does 350 words at a time and then gets up and does something else and then does the next 350 words, and it's all draft. But in Stephen King's book, he had a bit where he was like, I'm going to show you what comes out. And it was so good. And I was like, that's really annoying. Like, what I needed to see was something that didn't make sense. He's like, see, this wasn't perfect. I used too many adverbs. And I was like, what's an adverb? So and that's annoying to me when people have their draft, but and this is the thing, is that you will write, and every now and then there is a sentence that you're like, that's a sentence. No, I nailed that. Don't know where it came from. Everything around it doesn't make sense. And you've written that sentence 11 different times and finally got it. But yeah.
No, go ahead.
Natasha, this question for you. I heard you on No Filter with Mia, and I haven't read your book yet, and I found the way that you wrote about grief refreshing. My question is, did you have opposition from the loved ones who, like your brother and your former partner, did you have opposition when writing the book?
I wrote the book because I'm a coward and told no one I was writing the book. So no opposition when no one's knows that you're writing a book. And I think the reality of writing a book is that my story is naturally intertwined with other people's stories. That's just the reality. So I tried wherever possible. I think the question to myself was, does this need to be here? So is it necessary? Is it true? And is it kind? So if it was a story where someone wasn't shown in a great light, it didn't need to be there. It's not a burn book. It's not a book to criticize people. It's a book to talk about grief and the complexity of grief. And so I think when you're writing any book, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, the people who love you will continue to love you, whatever you've written in a book. And so maybe even more so by the end of the book, because they'll understand you a little bit better. So I think for me it was, am I showing the people who I've lost in the best kind of light and honouring the love I had for them? And if I was true to that, I just had to accept that.
I was just going to ask the question to both of you. I presume you're working on something else, and I wanted to ask what's next. If you can tell us a little bit.
I was going to ask you that.
You go first.
Okay, I'll go first. I'm writing fiction, which I thought is my second book is going to be so easy. But then I chose a completely different genre. It is not easy. I asked Jane Harper that. I did a Q&A thing with her a little while ago, and I said, does it get easier? And she's like, absolutely.
Liar.
So I'm finding that very difficult, but it's about mental illness, and it is, the way that I'm describing it is, have you read The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath? So it's sort of like The Bell Jar 50 years on. And if a woman was, at 30 and found herself at a point of mental health crisis, what are the things that might have led to that? What are the things in the world we live in now that might bring her to a point of complete madness? And so I'm sort of...
Must be a long book.
Yeah, exactly right. That's what I keep doing. I'm repeating.
So many things.
Vision to pay gap, and then there's just so much to throw in. But it's interesting to say things. Again, it's like the truth versus fact thing. It feels so true, even though the people aren't real in them. But then there's also the element of one of the characters has just turned into one of my really good friends. And because that's what you do, you just draw on things. And I was at dinner the other night, I was like, you're in my book and something really bad happens to you. And that's really weird. I feel as though I've got to ask him permission. I'm going to have to send it to him before, because it's weird. The things that I've borrowed from his life. And I didn't realise that would happen with fiction, but it totally does. What are you working on?
Also fiction. But again, it's similar to what you're saying. I've writing things, I'm like, wow, this is really exposing, even though it's fiction.
Yes.
But because you're writing things, I'm worried that people think, oh, well, that's obviously what Natasha thinks.
Yeah.
I feel. So yeah, that is that balance of fiction is actually more exposing in some ways.
Are you finding it easier or harder than the
Much
first?
harder. And again, because I was like, well, second book, nailed it, like,
Yeah.
fine. And then it's that thing of, oh my God, people will actually read it. So there's that pressure of
Yeah.
it could become
Yes.
a real book sometime. Whereas this was like, no one is ever going to read it. It doesn't matter how messy it gets.
Yeah.
So
The
yeah, the
only
pressure.
thing I will say about having written one before is that as I wrote this, and I think you had the same, I had no sense that it was possible that I could complete a book.
Yes.
I knew I could start, I knew I could write 500 words, but I did not believe in my heart that I could finish a book. And I remember reading something one day that said, you don't have to believe you can finish a book in order to finish a book. And I was like, oh, thank God. Because at no point was that deadline ever being met. And so I was like, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to keep writing bits and see if the bits end up into a thing. And it did end up into a thing. And so now every now and then when I get that anxiety, I go, I do believe I can finish this, which is not something I had with the first, when you see it kind of bound and
I remember the day that I finished it.
Yeah.
I didn't realize I finished it, and I just stopped writing and went, I just finished. Like I didn't know that's where it was going to end or what would tie it all together. But like finishing an entire book seems like a ridiculous concept. And
it's also, I think it was the best moment. So I was talking to someone recently, and it's like you get other incredible moments, which is talking to people about your book, and you know, where people even like sales, and you get like all kind of caught up in that. And I'm like, no, the best moment was the day I finished it, and I went to the beach and I sat there and I was like, oh, I wrote a book. Like that it doesn't get better than that. Nothing in the world can, you know, good reviews, bad reviews, whatever. It's like that's the feeling of satisfaction.
We've got a few questions on Zoom, so I'll try and go through them quickly. I'm going to ask one that actually relates to what you were just talking about now. Jonathan's asking, is there anything you can learn from writing non-fiction that helps writing fiction?
So much. They are so much more similar in a lot of ways than I thought, in that it is still, with non-fiction, you think, oh, well, it's true, I don't have to invent plot, which you don't. But the thing about any book being a collection of scenes is true for anything you're ever going to write. And the other rule, I have a page where I've just written all of this, is what is it? Arrive late, leave early to any scene. You're nodding because you will know from writing crime fiction. Yes. Like the number one rule is like not never start, but don't start with the character brushing their teeth in the morning. No one cares. So it's like start at lunch and leave before. And so I learnt that through the first one. Also, the feedback that I got, I mean, the editing process of just people saying, the biggest one was sometimes a chair leg is just a chair leg. Explain the shape. It's true, essentially. How about you?
I think, you know, when I was writing this and I started out, people, you know, who were sort of involved in the process from the outset, like I did a manuscript assessment, and even when I'd finished, had a completed book, it was like, yeah, but what are you trying to say? Like, what is the point of it? Not like in a mean way, but what is the point of it? It can't just be about grief. Like, what is the actual point? What's the central question you're trying to figure out here? And I think the same would be true of fiction. It's not just a whole lot of scenes thrown together and here's an arc and now there's some tension. What are you actually trying to say in this book? So I think, that regardless of whether it's fiction or non-fiction, there has to be some sort of, there has to be a point, like why you write.
Yeah. Hannah Kent, I heard her speak recently, and she said she has a journal that she keeps alongside the book she's writing, and she literally writes it down. So it's like, what's the point of this chapter? What are you trying to do? What are you trying to say? And keep that there, because again, we've all had the experience of getting to the end of the book and going, I don't know why that was written.
Yeah. This question to Natasha. Natasha, what coping strategies did you use while writing about this Heartsick?
None, and I don't recommend that. No. Just a spiral. No, I think I don't know. I think having support from people who knew me, like, so, you know, my husband Dean and my closest friends knew I was writing the book, who just kept reminding me, like, this is your story and you have a right to tell it. And that panic of what will happen and what will the judgment be, and like just to switch off that voice, so to have that sort of support network of people who are on your side, who want to, you know, who care for your health, your mental health and all of those things, and who believe in you, just to keep having that support, that little support network there all the time.
Thank you. That question was from Ethan. And the last question is for Jessie. I think it's a 3-part question. First part of it, this is from Angela. What works of fiction are you reading at the moment? What works of fiction have you found inspiration in? And were you taken by surprise by your book's massive success?
So the fiction book that I'm reading at the moment is actually Ultimo Press. I'm reading Diana Reid's new one. There is a feeling as a writer when you read something really good where it's like literally fuck you, like and you have to try and put that aside, and it's like
I'm happy for you, but
and then you read the next page and you're like no, and then as well because you're like Australian and I'm trying to write fiction, I'm like no, really is good. Oh my god, it's so good. But then you go learn from it. I'm trying to learn from it. The other fiction, I just love women's fiction. So I read all like Leanne Moriarty. I love Sally Rooney. I know that's unpopular to say now, but I love her. I love anything that's popular. I also love crime fiction. So Derville and McTiernan and yeah, I just can get through those so fast. And loved like Boy Swallows Universe, and Bronze Horseman is one of my favorites ever. Yeah, and anything that everyone's like, oh, that's so common and popular, like it's on my list. And in terms of the success, it's funny because I think you'll never see it as a success. It's a weird thing with any creative work. Yes, and there are moments where you just go, I cannot believe that this happened. I was in the US recently and it came out that day in the US, and I thought it wouldn't be in a bookshop yet because it's normally quite slow in Australia, not sometimes it comes out on the 30th and you go to a bookshop and it's not there yet. In the US it was there. So it was out in the shop, and to actually hold it in you know, some square in New York, I was like, oh, that's pretty surreal. So in that way, yes. But then I think everyone has weird benchmarks of success for their book, and you're never going to reach all of them, and that's why you maybe keep writing. And
does the benchmark keep changing for you? Like,
yes.
You think, oh, I'll be happy when that happens, and then that happened, you're like, oh.
Yes, and maybe I didn't really, and I find this with a lot of benchmarks and sense of success. You think that success will be a feeling. So it was never like, I want to sell X amount of copies or blah, blah, blah. I never had that. I was like, I just want to feel like it did well. And you can't ever measure a feeling of that. And I think as well, I assumed that when people write books and when it's like done, you feel an enormous sense of pride. And there is a little bit of pride, but you also hate page 30. Like you still hate it. And so there's still things that I look at and go, oh, if I'd had another year, another 2 years, but you don't. So yeah, it's a funny relationship, I think.
And I'll just end this as a comment from Kylie. Just wanted to say it was great, honest discussion about the topics. Congratulations to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you everybody. Like I said, please feel free, the books are kind of scattered all over, and have some wine, have some cheese and crackers, and yeah, enjoy your evening. And thank you to the two of you again for coming. It was a pleasure to be here and listen to this incredible discussion.
Thank you for having us. When's your deadline? Oh, I have a deadline. Oh, yeah, no, I'm back. But like, I need to check that. I need that. I need to yeah. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, maybe I've never been part of a very organized person.
Yeah, that sounds great.
But I've heard people.
How do you feel?
Was it? I wanted to be.